This session of Studium Generale about Solid. But let's start with the begin. In 1989, the World Wide Web was invented at CERN. The British software engineer Tim Berners-Lee, that's a name which is coming back this evening, he was one of the inventors of this World Wide Web, and his intention was to create a so-called internet for the scientists working at CERN to share their data as quickly as possible around the globe. That was the basic idea. In the meantime, this science web grew out to a huge World Wide Web, which we all know today and which we use every day. I see people checking their emails, so they're still using it. Tim Berners-Lee is still very much involved with his invention of the internet, and he has lots of worries about the deterioration of the internet. He fears data superpowers like Meta, Amazon, Apple and Google, which are behaving like huge data harvesters. So they're taking our data and they're selling it to the highest bidder. That's what really worries Tim Berners-Lee. To fix the internet, and I'm only stating it very briefly, he wants to secure our private data. And Berners-Lee, he introduced a smart web application called Solid, and that's some sort of a personal data space where you can save your personal data securely. What this Solid exactly is, how this works, and how Solid can fix the internet, that's what Esther de Loof is going to explain us this coming hour. Esther, I'm very happy you traveled all the way from Belgium to Enschede to share your knowledge about Solid. Let me introduce you. Your background is in experimental psychology, and now you're into the SolidLab. You're the business developer and operations director of SolidLab, and you're coordinating the implementation of Solid in Flanders.
Correct.
Yes?
Correct.
Okay. This is Esther. I want a big hand for Esther. And Esther, please explain what Solid is all about.
Thank you, Peter. I am going to quickly, if it all works, I'm just going to quickly exit this PowerPoint, because before we start, I just want to place everything into the right context by showing you this little clip of people explaining the internet in 1994. All right, let's see if the audio works. There we go.
Back now at 56 past, I wasn't prepared to translate that as I was doing that little tease.
Oh, that's
that little
right.
mark with the A and then the ring around it.
At?
See, that's what I said. Katie said she thought it was about.
Yeah. Oh.
But I'd never heard it.
Around.
I'd never heard it said. I'd always seen the mark, but never heard it said. And then it sounded stupid when I said it. Violence at NBC.
I heard be around big fight up in the lunchroom the other week.
There it is. Violence at NBC. GE.com. I mean,
well, Allison should know.
What is internet anyway?
Internet is that massive computer network. The one that's becoming really big now.
What do you mean? That's big. How does one? What do you write to it like mail?
No, a lot of people use it and communicate. I guess they can communicate with NBC writers and producers. Allison, can you explain what internet is?
No, she can't say anything in 10 seconds or less.
Oh, Allison will be in the studio shortly.
What does
it mean?
It's a giant computer network made up of started from.
Oh, I thought you were going to tell us what this was.
It's like a computer billboard.
It's not in it. It's a computer billboard, but it's nationwide. And it's several universities and everything all joined together.
Right.
And others can access it.
Right.
And it's getting bigger and bigger all the time.
It came in really handy during the quake. A lot of people, that's how they were communicating out to tell family and loved ones they were okay, because all the phone lines were down.
I was telling Katie, and I've been
talking. But you don't need that. You don't need a phone line to operate internet. No.
Why do I like to show this little clip at the start? Just to give you a sense that we're going to talk today about Solid, this kind of new iteration of the web that Sir Tim Berners-Lee is trying to make a reality. But people today talking about Solid, it's basically like people in the 90s talking about the internet. What is it? Some people look at some very little detail, like this @ symbol. What is this? Or this one particular use case, the earthquake case or the flooding case. Or is it something that comes from you in the academic sphere? Is that what the internet is going to be? So this big confusion about what is it and what is it going to become. Now today, 30 years later, we know how impactful the internet has become. And I'm very curious what Solid is going to become in, let's say, 10 to 20 years. But I'm sure about one thing, we probably don't fully realize yet what Solid as a core new iteration of the internet is going to mean. But I'm going to try and unpack that for you this evening and make it a little bit more tangible than it is probably now. Before we start, who has already heard about Solid at some point? And then I'm guessing that the other people in the room haven't heard about Solid yet. I will just very briefly give you a basic idea of what Solid is. Solid is a very thin extra layer that we are going to add on top of the existing web that we currently have, so that people and organizations can once again have some control, some say over their data on the web and how that data is being used. That is basically what Solid is all about. It's giving us, as people, as companies, our own place again on the internet to take control over our data. Okay, now, this Solid thing, it was invented by Sir Tim Berners-Lee a couple of years back. And in Flanders, our minister-president 2 years back has said, okay, I see the potential of Solid. We've got a couple of key researchers in Flanders working on Solid. He thinks that this is of great importance for us as a society and for the economy in Flanders and in Europe. So he has decided Flanders, the region of Flanders, is going to give each of their citizens a pod for their personal data, and then we are going to start building services and businesses on top of that citizen-owned fabric of data. And SolidLab is one of the initiatives that the government took in the context of wanting to launch Flanders as some of the first Solid-enabled regions in the world. So I'm going to tell you a little bit about what is Solid, what do we do at SolidLab, and why exactly is this happening in Flanders, and what's the relation of to what is currently happening in the Netherlands, because believe it or not, I think apart from Flanders and the UK, Netherlands is going to be, I think, among the first 3 regions where Solid is going to be taking off in the next couple of years. I would say we have a Q&A at the end, so if you have any complex questions, maybe save them up for the end. But if I say anything or use a term that you don't get, just raise your hand and we'll take that question now so that you don't get lost during the presentation. Is that okay? All right. So, in Flanders, we started from the basic idea that our society is only as strong as the way that we share info. Any big society, any big empire in world history was in part made possible by the utilities that they had. Think about how you supply your society with clean water, a sewage system, but in more recent years, to have power delivered at your home, to have a telephone delivered at your home, or today, the internet. And so in Flanders, we think about owning your own data, having control over your own data, as a core utility that we need for societies in Europe and across the world in the century to come. So we really see this having control over your own data as a core utility that you need for your society. And of course, the internet has become a major driver of innovation in the last 30 years, but we haven't seen its full potential yet. How we in Flanders look at the recent developments of the internet is one of the key players in Flanders is IMEC. I work for IMEC, and also one of our other research partners, Vito. We've done a lot in the past 10 years around smart city projects, having all types of sensors and city of things and Internet of Things use cases. And that has given us some very interesting pilots. But we've noticed if we really want to take these use cases around sensor data and smart cities to the next level, we need to have a way to have people and companies and organizations having a way to participate. Because now, sometimes we do experience some backlash against some of these smart city use cases because, of course, there's a lot of personal data involved in those cases. And citizens start questioning, but wait a second, how do you get my data? And can I have a say in how it is being used? And if I see that my data is not correct, can I go in there and can I tweak my data? For instance, if I see that my address is wrong, or I see that some kind of input about me isn't fully what I wanted it to, how can I have some control over my data? So we notice there we need a way for people to have a say, but also for the business cases behind these smart city use cases, we notice that it's difficult for organizations to join in these use cases because it often now requires them to fully open up their data. And often organizations, they want to share their data for a particular purpose with a particular third party, but just opening up all their data for everyone to use is often a very big step for them to take. So not only for people, but also for any other player in the field, we need a more controlled, refined way of being able to share your data. So that is something that we are missing to really take this potential of a connected world, having all of these smart devices connected to the web, to really leverage that potential. And this very complex sharing of data is only increasing. So now the big buzzword in the EU is now data spaces. No one has a definition of what a data space is, but we're all talking about data spaces. We're all talking about organizations who are connecting their databases and who are sharing info. Now, from this slide, you don't need to think about much. I'm not going to explore what a broker is and a clearinghouse. But I think the most important thing is, and I don't know whether you can see my mouse. No, you can't. So I will point with the clicker. Yes. On this side of this image here, for this data space, you have the data provider who is providing data into the data space. And then here on the other side, you have the data consumer who is consuming that data from the data space. And we do have the icon of a person standing here on the data provider side and the icon of a person here at the data consumer side. But in reality, a lot of these European data space projects are built for B2B, business-to-business cases. And there isn't actually a plan of how you're going to get actual people in the loop here. There may be an icon of a person there, but have no mistake, it's usually an organization or a company that we are thinking about in these European use cases. And what we want to do from a solid point of view is to say, look, if we are going to take the GDPR seriously, we need to think about how are we going to give real people a say in these very complex, enormous data spaces that we are about to build. And if we don't figure that out now, if we leave it as an afterthought that we're going to start thinking about once these data spaces are large and are real, it's going to be very difficult to get it in there after building it. Okay. That is the general background. As we already touched upon slightly, we really need to take into account how we give people a space in this new data sharing world that we are building. Because what we are experiencing is a data paradox at the moment. That's a statement from one of my colleagues, Professor Lieven de Marais. He does research about the adoption of new technologies in Flanders. And every year he has this large study where he probes an entire cross-section of the Flemish people to kind of test out how do people relate to new technologies that have been popping up over the past years. And of course, with Corona and with the COVID lockdowns, we have seen major shifts in some people becoming more comfortable for sharing data or having access to digital, all kinds of digital offerings, because of course we were locked down in our homes and we had to use them. And on the other hand, you also see that a lot of people have become much more aware about their personal data. We had a COVID certificate that we had to show when we wanted to enter a restaurant. Did you also have it in the Netherlands? Yeah. And we had quite some backlash, in particular from the more right-leaning part, but also from the extreme left, on how much of a privacy issue it was to be so closely tracked by the government. So with his Digimeter, Lieven kind of tries to see how we in Flanders feel about living our digital lives. And what we see is that people don't really feel all that comfortable around sharing their personal data. On the one hand, we want all of those personalized services that we could potentially get. But on the other hand, we have a lot of questions. Who controls my data? Who has access to it? For what purpose? For how long? Who are they sharing my data with? Or on the other hand, hey, all of these players have access to my data, but actually I would like to use that data and give it to this or this citizen science project or whatever third party who could do something useful with my data, either useful for me or useful for the society. And at this point, I don't have a very clean, efficient way to take my data and to share it from one party to another party at my own will. So this sense of, hey, we need to figure something out about how to use our personal data in a better way, I think it's led to a few answers in the recent years. Of course, a very important first step was the legal frameworks in Europe. So we've got the GDPR, of course. Not only in Europe do we have those frameworks. I know that in California, there's a similar law that was established. Also in Australia, there are some laws that are GDPR-ish. GDPR? The General Data Protection. It basically it's a set of rules from the European Union trying to tweak our digital services that we use into asking for your consent, having clear terms and conditions when they are using your personal data. And they also say, for instance, you have the right to be forgotten by a digital service that you are using, or you have the right to ask for a download of your personal data. And then often you have to email them 10 times to get it, and you get it in a very cumbersome shape. Just a very, not so easy to use data dump. So the GDPR, the intention behind it was very good, but in practice, what has it led to? Basically, it's led to a lot of pop-up screens and cookies. And basically what I do is half of the time, I just click OK, and then the other half of the time, I click the least possible data sharing that I can possibly do, but I'm not really consistent in it and I don't really pay attention just because it's cumbersome. I just want to read the text that I want to access, or I want to watch the video. I don't want to think the whole time about who I'm sharing my data with. So the legal frameworks are very useful, but maybe not quite the answer that we were looking for. Another reaction, I think, to this sense of, I don't really have a good understanding of how my data is being used, are personal data stores. Who in the audience has ever heard about personal data stores or uses one? Not a lot of people, but there are a few. Okay. I think the most known ones are, as said on the screen, Miko, DigiMe, Solid is also there. Now, what is a personal data store and what does it typically do? Typically, it does a couple of things. It's a way for you to have a full view on who am I sharing my data with. And Some services also offer you the ability to shut down some of that data sharing and to keep it minimal. Or some other services in this realm give you the opportunity to actually gain some money from sharing your data. So instead of some data broker sharing your data behind your back and making some money off of it, now you are the person who is making some money off of sharing your own data. So that's typically the kind of applications that we have in that realm. There are also a couple of challenges here. I think for having some transparency about your data, these services often do a great job, but I think we can get much more value from actively sharing our data for purposes that we hold dear. I think there is still a lot to be gained. And a lot of these services aren't that easy to, let's say if you're using one service and you want to move on to the next one, that's often not an easy thing to do. So there's still some interoperability work to be done there. Now, the way that Tim Berners-Lee looks at this issue of our personal data on the web is basically saying, yep, those legal frameworks are useful. Those personal data spaces and those personal data stores, they have a sense of the direction we want to go in. But actually, we need a much more fundamental midway course correction for the web as we currently know it. This is really something that we need to solve on a fundamental, deep level. And that is why he proposes to add this thin additional layer on top of the existing web to give you a way to have some more control over your data. Now, how does this work? Currently, the way that the internet currently works is we typically have me or you as a person. We have our data scattered around a lot of companies who hold some part of our data. So don't only think about Facebook, LinkedIn, those big players. Also think about your local government or local stores and shops that you have some relation with. They probably all have an account about you, some basic data, and then probably some information about the thing that they have been selling you, the product or the service. The problem about this way of treating data is I as a person don't really have a lot of control over my data. For instance, if some part of my data is sitting with company A, there's no easy way to share it with company B, for instance. I now have to go to company B, and the information that I have already given to company A here, for instance, my address, I also again need to give it to company B. And if I move houses, then I need to contact all of those companies to say, can you please now send my mail to this new address where I live? And then it typically takes me a year to figure out, have I updated each of those service providers to have my new address? So it doesn't really offer me a lot of value, and I really have a lot of work to keep all of those separate databases in sync with my actual data. In a solid world, we treat this in a different way. So in a solid world, each of us will have their own personal data store where you keep all of your data. And then companies who want to use your data, for instance, they want to know your address so that they can give you, for instance, a Christmas card. Well, that company can now come to your pod and ask, can I have access to your address data? And then you can say yes or no. And the company always has access to the most recent version of your data. So instead of, in this scenario, I have to update my address in each of those databases, in this world, in the solid world, I just update my address once in my own personal data store, and all of the companies, these clicker buttons, yeah. All of the companies that I've given access to my address always have access to the most recent version of it. So that data really works for me. Also, because I'm the one controlling all of my data, let's say, for instance, that company A produced some information about me For instance, let's say company A is an energy provider. They know how energy efficient my house is. I may say, hey, I want to have an energy efficiency screening of my house by some specialist because I want to reduce my bill, because we all know that electricity has become a little bit more expensive over the last year. It would be ideal if I would have control over that energy efficiency data of my home so that I can directly decide, okay, I'm going to share it with company B here, who is going to give me an energy audit of my home. In the current world, that's not really feasible because the energy company is keeping my energy data. There's no way for me to easily say, okay, I'm going to share this data that's sitting here with company B. In a solid world, that would become possible. So it's about having a more efficient way of managing your data, and it's about having an easy way to share your data to get more and better services. Another way of looking at it, so that you really get the concept of how Solid works, is the following way of looking at it. The basic idea of Solid and how Solid works is, today we have platforms, such as, for instance, Facebook, that offer you both your account, so basically your identity, they store your data, and they offer you a service on top of that data. In Solid, we split those three things into separate things. So you have your identity on the one hand, your data in your personal data vault, and then a whole set of services can access that data. So let's apply it to, for instance, this example around your contact lists and your agenda. So in the world today, I have on my Facebook account, I have my contact list of my Facebook friends, I have my pictures, and I have my schedule, my agenda as present in Facebook. Then in LinkedIn, I also have a list of my contacts, and maybe those overlap for a bit with my personal friends, but often those will be more like business contacts. And then in Doodle, I also have some version of my agenda sitting there. Now the problem is, if I am now planning a party with my friends on Facebook, and I also want to invite some of my colleagues that I'm only connected to on LinkedIn, and I want to make sure that the date when I'm scheduling my party both fits my social agenda as known in Facebook, but also my work agenda as, for instance, it's known in Doodle, there's no easy way of doing that, because there is no easy way to combining these two agendas or combining these two contact lists. What would this problem look like in a Solid world? Well, that's here on the left side. So in my personal data pod, I would have all of my info, my pictures, regardless of which app I used to make them or to see them, my agenda, again, regardless of what tool I used to make my agenda items, and my contact lists, again, independent of how I made that contact. And then I can freely pick whatever photo gallery I want to use to look at all of my pictures, or whatever social feed I want to use to plan a party with my friends that matches our agendas. Or I can use whatever meeting scheduler that I want, and it will work with both all of my agenda items and all of my contact list items. So in this way, by cleanly splitting data on the one hand, which all resides in my pod, from the applications that run on it, I can freely choose which application I am going to use. And the example that one of my friends always gives here is Facebook is currently where he, his kids, and his parents usually share their family pictures. But Facebook is not the ideal interface for grandparents, and it's not the ideal interface for kids. If we would redesign the world, what we would do is we would have our pictures here, and the grandparents could look at it through a photo gallery that suits them, and the kids will probably use a different app to look at the same pictures. But in this world, you can actually pick the app that suits you best. instead of everyone being forced to use one and the same user experience that maybe fits the average person, but isn't ideal for the various niches that we have in our society. So a lot of innovation is possible if we split data from apps. Okay, now back to the situation in Flanders. So at the start of my talk, I talked about all of these smart city projects with these sensors. That's all powered by linked data. That's a part that we have an experience in for over a decade now. And then on the other hand, we have my good friend and colleague, Professor Ruben Verborg, who has added the solid element to it. So how are we going to give people and organizations control again over their personal data and their organization data through Solid? And that is what we basically combine in SolidLab. But that is only the technical side of the story. Knowing how to build those servers, how to put that linked data on these servers, and how to make sure that you as a person has control over how the data sharing is taking place. That's the technical part of Solid. Of course, if we really want to make this core technology a reality, it's going to take so much more. We need a legal framework around this data sharing. We need a business model. Who's going to pay for those pods? Are we as citizens ourselves going to pay for it? Is the government going to pay for it? Is a private entity going to pay for it? How are we going to do this? We're going to need a governance model. Okay, who is allowed to enter this data space that we are building? What kind of identity provider specifications do we want to enforce on this ecosystem? Or can you just log in with any username, password combo? So how are we going to govern this? Also on the security level, what kind of security requirements do we need for these pods? Because this pod is going to contain a lot of your personal data, and of course, you don't want to store it somewhere where it's easily hackable. So to answer all of those questions, we've basically, and this is unique in Flanders, we've collected the best departments from both the Catholic University of Leuven, the University of Ghent, and the Free University of Brussels. Usually, universities in Flanders, they compete, but for this project, we were able to get the best groups from all three players and put them together in one project, SolidLab. And what these various groups do, we basically cover all of those layers of interoperability that you need to bring Solid to the market. So very basic, what technical building blocks do you need? Knowledge about semantic web tools, scalability, security, basically all of the boring stuff. On the standardization level, we need data standards to be able to interchange these data between various parties. Got plenty of experience there. And then, as I said, on the business models, who is going to pay for it? And on the user adoption and user experience side, what are the different sub-groups within the Flemish world? And how are we going to bring what use cases to the market so that we can make sure that Solid isn't only something for people in their 20s, but that also my mother can enjoy a world where Solid enables her life. And as we talked about, the legal framework and then the governance framework. So what do we do at SolidLab? I've thrown up a couple of questions, the type of questions that we are trying to answer. For instance, I'm just going to quickly translate to English. If all of my personal data is in that pod, doesn't that mean that I become very vulnerable to a data breach? For instance, that's one of the questions that I often get. Well, the answer to that question is, we talk about you are going to have your own personal data pods, but in reality, I don't think you're going to have just one pod. You're going to have many. Because, first of all, you'll probably have a couple of pods in the cloud, as we currently have it. So in Flanders, the government is going to give each citizen their own personal data pod that sits in the cloud. But I can imagine very soon that not only the government will give you a data pod, but also your bank, your electricity provider may also want to offer you your own data pod for that particular data, because maybe banking data requires some additional availability and security measures. that don't necessarily hold for government data. Or your medical data may require a different type of pod than your government data. So I see you having a couple of cloud-based pods. Then we also see some interest from, let's say, more of the wallet providers to have a pod with some very sensitive data that just lives on your phone. And basically, if you lose your phone, you lose your data. But that's a very secure way of having your data just locally, not in some cloud, but just on your phone, as long as you don't lose your phone, of course. And then we also have some cases where Solid could even live on the smart devices, such as your Fitbit or some of the appliances in your home. You just have your Solid pod on chip on the device instead of it living in the cloud. I think that will especially be the case for sensor data and streaming data. So in truth, your data is going to be spread out across a lot of pods. So breaking into one pod, if it would ever happen, doesn't necessarily mean a data breach on all of your data. That's one thing. Encryption, of course, is another. What is, I think, going to be the most important threat vector on Solid that we want to control? That is that, of course, you will have some web ID that interconnects all of these various pods. And hacking someone's web ID, I think that is the main security risk that we need to worry about. And that's why we have some of our groups in Leuven, some of our security groups, looking in particular to the identity bit of Solid, how we're going to make sure that, that this doesn't become a vulnerability in the system. On the identity part of Solid, what is happening in Flanders? We've got a local startup, Digita, who is bringing this web ID, this concept of having an identifier on the web that points to you as a person. They are bringing a service to the market, use.id, where you as a person can mint your very first web ID, see it as your kind of new email address on the web, your own identifier. And then but that only gives you your identifier to have a strong login. I don't know, do you know It's Me already in the Netherlands? It's a very famous identity provider in Flanders. We basically use it for all government and banking services. So It's Me is one of the main players that is now looking to see whether they can connect to Solid. And we're also working, for instance, with Trust Builder, which is a company that interconnects a lot of identity providers across Europe, so that we can really scale this identity part of Solid to the European market, not just the Flemish market. And then on a global level, we're working together with Microsoft. They are really very much focusing on decentralized identifiers. And so they want to understand how that DID world, how that relates to the web IDs in the Solid world, and whether we want to make a connection, and if we want to make a connection, how we do that. It's a bit of a complex story. We're not going to solve it, I think, in the coming couple of months, but that's an ongoing conversation that we're having, because that would basically also help us scale this ecosystem much faster. A Solid application. How should I imagine a Solid application working? I think that can be a lot of things. People now often talk about Solid apps. I don't really like talking about Solid apps because I think every application in the future will be Solid enabled in some way. Where could you see Solid in an app? Say, for instance, I have an application of my energy provider. They offer me a service to do an energy scan of my home. In that flow of giving them access to my data, that is where I'm going to use Solid. So if they say, okay, to do this energy scan, we would like to have access to these data for this purpose, for this time, then I will be able to say, okay, you can have access to this data, but I don't give you access to that data. Or for instance, I only give you access to this data for a more reduced period. That is, I think, a flow where you will see Solid. But some parties in Flanders are also thinking a little bit broader. And then the first one is Mijn Burgerprofiel, my citizen profile, which is an application from the government. They are not only looking at having Solid use cases, so basically administration flows with the government enabled by Solid, But basically, my burgerprofiel is exploring, do we want to become the consent partner for the Flemish citizens? Not only to control the data that you share with the government, but also to control data that you share with other players. And is the government the right branding to be your consent partner? Not everyone agrees with that. The government thinks we want to offer this. But for instance, some of the banks, like the KBC, and some of the identity players like It's Me, or one of the other data vault players, Dokkel, they also are looking into, can we become this consent partner for the Flemish citizen? And it will require a lot of research and a lot of testing to see who is the ideal partner, or may it be that you will be comfortable for having some overview of your data through a government app and seeing some other part of your data through your banking app. It doesn't need to be an all-in-one story. It can be, but it doesn't necessarily have to be. Feeling where we draw that line, that's one of the things that we focus on. Are the Flemish citizens ready for Solid? Also something that we have been testing. We have run a test to see how do people feel about privacy, data sharing, personal data stores. What institutions do they trust when sharing their data? And then we validate it in some domains, for instance, in media. Now, I'm just going to focus on one of those results. So when we tested this, 7 out of 10 people in Flanders say they would like to experiment with using a personal data vault, which is already, I think, good, 70%. We haven't even explained yet what a personal data vault is or what you could use it for. But just the basic ID, 70% is willing to explore. And then we also try to determine, are there certain subsets in the populace in Flanders? And we found 3 groups. And they vary on 4 ways in which they relate to the more the newer services that are coming their way. How strong are their digital skills? How much privacy concerns do they have? What is their attitude toward personal data stores? And how much institutional trust do they have? And what do we see? The first profile of Flemish citizens, the privacy pioneers, they basically have good, they have good digital skills, they have a good attitude towards personal data stores, and they also have a lot of privacy concerns. So this is, I think, the sweet spot where we have people concerned about their privacy, but also very much willing to try out new things. That's about 1/3 of the populace, and they will probably be the first ones to use Solid. Then we have about 1/4, the argwanende achterblijvers, the suspicious stragglers. They have a lot of privacy worries, but really not a lot of trust in institutions or a lot of digital skills. So they will probably be the last ones to follow. And then the group that shows most promise in the long term are the worryless weathercocks, the onbezorgde opportunisten. They don't really have a lot of concerns about their privacy, but they are very skilled and they really have a lot of trust. I think this is typical for my parents. They don't really care about the sharing of their data. They are quite well skilled and they have a lot of trust. So I think first we're going to try and target the privacy pioneers with the first use cases, and then really see whether we can get the silent majority to follow. And that would already allow us to capture 70% of the population in Flanders. Okay, of course, this is what SolidLab does, so a lot of research, but we are not going to bring Solid to the market alone. So what we do is making sure that whatever we research is in function of how the market develops. Who are the organizations in the market that we are working with? Well, as I told you at the start, our minister-president, Jan Bon, said, okay, I really want to position Flanders on Solid. So apart from SolidLab, he also founded the Flemish Data Utility Company. This is the name now. The official launch with its new name is going to be for next week, so I can't tell you yet. But this is probably the last week that I will be talking about het Vlaams datanutsbedrijf, the Flemish data utility company. What do? Well, they basically do the same thing as SolidLab does. They also look at all layers of the cake that you need to bring the service to the market. On the technical side, they have used an enterprise-grade application, an enterprise-grade version of the Solid server that comes from Inrupt, the startup of Sir Tim Berners-Lee. It's applied on an Orange cloud that sits entirely within Europe, so on servers in Paris and in Amsterdam. And one of our local IT groups, Kronos, is the one who does the ticketing and the help desk. So this is, let's say, a Europe-proof offering of how to bring Solid to the market. And it will be the first pod provider in the market. We have a lot of experience on linked open data. And I think the most important thing is, especially here, the work that they've been doing over the last 2 years on making sure that the data utility company is the first data intermediary in Europe that is also in line with the new legal frameworks that are coming out of Europe, such as the Digital Governance Act that is coming up. And I think having this legal framework is really very hard to do. And I think having cracked that nut in Flanders will really help other regions in Europe getting started with Solid. And I think the Netherlands, there's already a lot of contact between the government in the Netherlands and that in Flanders to recycle some of that legal framework that we have been building. But I think the best work that we've done over the last year was trying to make sure that we work very closely together with Gaia X, which is more a business-to-business data space consortium, making sure that they understand why it's so important to have personal data and giving people some say in their data sharing to make sure that that is included in the architecture that they are building there. My Data is one of those organizations that is strong, especially in the Nordics, that have constructed a framework around personal data sharing. We are working together with them to make sure that we can show how we can implement the principles held high by My Data through the technology of Solid. And we are working very closely together with also the International Data Spaces Association, which is an organization very similar to Gaia X, and working together with the European Commission to make sure that whatever we do is in line with the new legal frameworks or the new technical architectures that are coming out of Europe. Voilà, that is basically what the Flemish Data Utility Company is doing. And then we also have a couple of startups in Flanders who are starting to work with Solid. I already mentioned Digita with their use.ai service. They really focus on the identity part of Solid. How are you going to get a web ID and through your web ID get access to all of your pods? We have Consolidate, which is a startup that focuses on building Solid apps. So how do you do a consent flow with Solid? And then Data Village. What they do is they basically create AIs that sit on top of your personal data pod so that you can locally, on your own data, run an AI to gain certain insights out of your data. And you are the only one who sees the insights out of that data. So instead of you shipping all of your data to some central server with an AI running on your data there, you are just going to take that AI, run it locally on your data that you have, and you're the only one who sees the results of it. And then in shaded in blue here is the We Are project of Vito. What Vito is doing with We Are is they are giving every citizen in Flanders their own medical data pod. And they are exploring the first use cases in the medical sphere. Don't think about your blood tests and your body scans. There's a lot of ethical framework that we're still lacking to share those types of data now. But when it comes to more like healthy lifestyle cases, those are cases that we can easily do in the coming months. And that's where Vito is now focusing more in the preventive healthy lifestyle and preventive healthcare sphere. Voilà, that's the entrepreneurship that's coming out of Flanders. Now, looking at all of these data spaces that we're building in Europe, and then this overarching cross-sectoral personal data space. That's all very much fancy, but now what is it going to mean in real life? What is it going to mean for us? What are the first use cases that we are going to see? And I think starting from this European framework around data spaces is not the right way of looking at it. Because this way of defining data spaces is very much vertical per vertical. And we as people, we don't live in vertical per vertical. Rather, we see it from a perspective of us as a person. And for a lot of our goals, we will need to collect data out of a lot of these sectors to facilitate our lives. So I don't really think about use cases in these verticals. I rather think in a person-centric way. And then this is basically how I think about it in my mind. I see a lot of first use cases around your core identity data, and then a cluster around everything about managing your career. So think about your education, and then once you have gained a degree, the further steps that you take in your professional life. Manage my leisure, so anything around culture, pleasure, media, travel. Then health, everything that has something to do with your physical body. So whether it's healthy lifestyle or really key medical assistance. Managing your home, everything about the energy efficiency of your house, buying and selling houses, but all of the data streams centered around your home. And then last is mobility. How do you get from point A to point B? With various, let's say, with the train and with a sharing car. How are you going to combine all of those services in one fluent user experience? For career and leisure, that is where we are already now working on the first use cases. Some have already gone live, others will go live this year. So this is where the action is already happening in real use cases. Health is a bit more difficult because it's a lot of sensitive data and we really need to treat this with extra care. But health is definitely also getting started, though I think it will take until next year before the first use case goes live. For home, there too, some use cases already in the pipeline now, but it will be the end of next year before they go live. And mobility, I think it's going to be until 2025 when the first use case goes live. But that's my estimate at this point. Let's have a look at what is already happening. So for career, for instance, let me take you through a use case that we have in Flanders with Randstad. And I'm just going to skip this so I can get you straight to this use case. So the first use case that is going live in Flanders is one where we are going to share diploma data with Randstad. How does this go? So we have the LED, the Leer- en Ervaringsbewijzen Databank, which is basically a database from the government that contains all of the credentials around the degree that you got at university and at university college. What we are going to do is, if you want to apply for a job and you want to have a official statement of your diploma, the LED is going to, on your request, put a verifiable credential copy of your diploma in your data vault. So notice, we are not going to automatically upload all of this data into your data vault. No. That would not give, we think, would not give you sufficient sense of control if we are going to preload your pot with data from the government. So you are going to be the one, as a citizen, who actually says, yep, get me that verifiable credential from this database, and please put it in my data vault. Once it's there, I can then again actively share that information with Randstad. And that will be shared, of course, GDPR proof. It will be, I am going to share this diploma with you for this particular purpose, to apply for this particular job, or within this certain timeline where you are going to assist me with finding a job. And the first types of diplomas that we are doing this for are diplomas in the medical realm. That's the first subsegment that we are focusing on. And Randstad is going to try this out very carefully at the beginning. So the first use case going live, they are really going to test it out where you go to the office and they take you through this entire flow to basically see what feels natural to people, where do they still have questions, and how do we need to optimize the user experience around loading data into your data vault and then sharing data from your data vault to really make sure that we have the user experience nailed before we go live with this to the wider public, to all types of, so not only medical licenses, but also other types of verifiable credentials around your trainings, and to also do it in a fully digital way without having a person in the loop. But so we're really moving this carefully along so that we don't lose people in the process. So this is one of the first use cases with Randstad. That's the one referred to here with the Flemish government and with Randstad. Next up will be a use case with Caramel. Caramel is basically an app that allows people to reskill. So let's say you've been working as a developer for 10 years, but you feel burned out, you feel maybe your creative side isn't being used enough, but you don't really know, I'm kind of missing something, but I don't know where my talent may really lie. Caramel gives you a whole set of tests to basically figure out if you want to do a career switch, how you can best do it. And they basically want to become a platform where a whole host of players from the HR sector can connect to, so that people can really be matched to the right job that fits their entire personal profile and where they want to move their career to. And then Dokkel, one of the data vault players in Flanders, they are going to work with the Flemish government on a professional administration case. So the case there is currently in Flanders for our taxes and for all kinds of personal benefits that we could get from the government bases that on wage data that is typically 2 years old. But if you lose your job today, you want to get that assistance now, not 2 years later. So the idea there is that we work together with Dokkel, because a lot of the employers in Flanders and a lot of the sociaal secretariaten, social secretaries, they work through Dokkel to send you your pay slip. So what Dokkel is going to do is extract that wage data from your pay slip and place it in your pod. So you can then, out of your own will, if you want to, give the government access to that data, so that if you, for instance, start working part-time, or you have a child, or there's something that happens that impacts your current wage, that you get an automatic ping from the government saying, hey, we noticed your wage dropped. You have now additional access to these and these and these benefits that we can offer you. Do you want to use them? So it's really proactive government working for you, but only, of course, if you choose to let the government have access to that data. Your consent is always the key thing. Voilà, that is what's happening in Flanders. We already run through this case. In Sweden, we have the VDAB in Vlaanderen. I don't know what the VDAB... Do you also have a VDAB in the Netherlands? It's basically the office, if you're unemployed, that helps you find a new job. UWV. Something work, something uitkering. Yeah. So basically, the UWV of Sweden, they are bringing a couple of use cases to the market around Solid. And then recently, we've also been collaborating with Prometheus X, which is let's say, a group of players in the educational technology sector that have formed a data space around skills in France, and they are now trying to see how can we connect to this solid world that is starting to pop up in Flanders. So that's what's already happening in the manage my career space. Then if we look at leisure, so I don't know whether you know the VRT, the Vlaamse Radio en TV. Yeah, so that's the public radio and television in Flanders. They've been experimenting with Solid for, I think now, 2 to 3 years. And now we are going to launch in the spring the Media Proeftuin, the Media Living Lab, where we are going to try out all kinds of use cases with the VRT around storing your media consumption in your pod, and then trying to figure out how we can use that information in a creative way to make sure that you have a more balanced diet when it comes to news, so that you don't live in your filter bubble with only left-wing or right-wing news or whatever colors your news feed. That's one of the cases. Another case is about detecting and making sure that you're less impacted by fake news, or some other, just to make sure that whatever media reaches you is actually really in line with your profile. So if you're, let's say, a very huge Bach fan, or you are very much of a heavy metal fan, that you're actually updated with the media items that will speak to you most. So that's what's happening in Flanders. The BBC has gone live with a first use case around Solid in the last fall. It was their Solid Watch Party. What was that exactly? It's basically a service where you with your friends can watch a movie on, you're each sitting in your own home, but you're all watching the same show. And the host of the show can pause the video or can do all sorts of social activities around you watching a movie together online. Apparently, this watching a movie together is something that started during Corona and that a lot of people have kept as a habit. So that's why the BBC picked this to try out a first use case around Solid. And I think they started their tryout in November, and I think it runs up until this spring. So if you want to try it out, you still can, but I think it will be the last months before the pilot project ends. And then, of course, here in the Netherlands, I don't know whether you know this, but all of the big media companies in the Netherlands have basically done a study of over a year to see, are there any challenges that we as a sector face that we want to tackle together? And they have identified this sharing of personal data as one of the things that they want to take focus on. And a couple of these players have come together to start the Stichting Nederlandse Datakluis, the Foundation Dutch Data Vault, and they are also exploring how to bring Solid to the market in the Netherlands. And I think it's really interesting to see how this market develops differently in Flanders versus here. So in Flanders, when we tested what sector do you trust to provide you with your own data pod, in Flanders, the government is the #1 winner. We have a lot of trust in our government. From talking to people in the Netherlands over the past year, I've noticed that the idea of having the government provide you with a pod doesn't really always sit well with the Dutch. Am I correct? Yeah. But the question is, how do you feel about this ragtag, well, not really, this whole collection of all of the media players coming together and saying, we want to give you a pod, we want to be your partner in your, let's say, data sharing journey. Do you feel more comfortable about them giving you a pod compared to the government? Even less. I think we have identified a hot topic for the Q&A to delve in why that is. Yeah. Okay. So that was for the media sphere. Then for health, I already mentioned to you, we are that project from Vito that is bringing the first, let's say, medical data or healthcare solid pods to the market. Let's see if this, perfect, my next slide. So the way that I think about it is I think about this whole data cloud around my physical body. I think about it as a spectrum with, on the one end of the spectrum, really sensitive data. So a scan of my body, my blood tests, all of that core medical data. That I think, to share this, we are going to need a very strong ethical framework that players from the government and of the big hospital sectors can all agree with. But I think that will be necessary before we see the first use cases with this very sensitive, typical hospital data. A little bit further on the spectrum, we have, let's say, your Fitbit data or your intelligent scale, all these types of data from wearables and appliances in your home that inform your healthy lifestyle. That is, I think, where we will see the first use cases happening. And then on the more extreme side of the spectrum, it's all about your body size, healthy eating habits, which more brands into, let's say, for instance, having the right measures of your body in your pod so that if you go online shopping for clothes, you buy the right shoes and the right clothing for your particular body. So there, for instance, we are seeing to work together with a company that is specialized in, basically you enter a couple of measurements into that system, and that AI then basically generates a full 3D profile of your body that you can then use to do clothes shopping in a much more precise way. And by the way, there's a lot of waste in the shopping industry and the clothing realm at the moment. So cutting down there also comes with a lot of, think of, benefits to our society. The NHS in the UK is already since a couple of years looking into using solids. I don't know how the healthcare system works in the Netherlands, but I can say that in Flanders it's rather siloed, and there's really value in interconnecting all of the databases of all of those hospital systems. In the UK, of course, you've got the NHS, which operates on a national scale, but although the NHS is one big thing, there's a lot of silos and a lot of legacy systems that each of the various players in the NHS use. And they really see value in having one online patient dossier where all of your data live. And then it doesn't matter which hospital you are going to, your data is traveling with you, instead of you having to drag your data from one hospital to the other with a lot of disconnects in that current system. And so when you talk to the people in the UK, whereas in Flanders it's mainly the government that is really driving solid. In the Netherlands, then you have the media sector that is driving solid. In the UK, it's much more the healthcare sector that is really pushing hard for a solid. And what you see there is that for them, if they would establish a data utility company or a SolidLab in the UK, there would need to be a very heavy focus on ethics, having an ethical framework around sharing these data. So basically, every region that joins has their own emphasis and brings something new to the table. And I think we're going to have to gather all of these perspectives around Solid to really make it work. I'm mentioning here the Solid Manchester community, which is a community around Solid. And that's where in November of last year, we, for the first time, brought together all of the players in the UK who were looking at Solid. And there they have also decided, we are going to need a foundation who is going to bring those pods to the people, because just having the NHS providing you with a pod isn't going to cut it, or just the BBC giving you a pod. Maybe it would be better if there would be some neutral foundation that gives you your pod, a foundation that is neutral towards the other players in the market. Voilà. And we are also talking to TNO in the Netherlands to see if we can collaborate on some of those medical use cases. So who knows, in a couple of years, Flanders and the Netherlands are going to join forces on Solid for healthcare.
Esther, can you round off in a couple of minutes?
This is my last slide. Okay. Perfect timing. And the last one is home. So there we are working on the entire data flow around buying and sharing houses. That is where the government is in the driver's seat. But we're also talking to, for instance, the utility companies. So basically the ones who are providing you with your digital meter for your electricity and your gas and your water, so that we can connect all of these sensors in your home to facilitate energy efficiency, water efficiency, a lot of those Green Deal topics. And then what my research group is also particularly good in is building info. So basically the whole information map around all of the materials that went into building your house, that whole construction and architecture worlds are also looking into having one single truth around your house. And for us, having that one single truth also in your home pod. And then if you sell your house, all of that information about your house is easily migrated from the first owner of the house to the second to the third without a loss of information in all of those times that the house is being sold. That's also one of the things that we are looking at. Voila, as said, that was the last slide.
Thank you.
I hope this was a little bit interesting for you, and any questions I think are now welcome.
Yeah, thank you very much, Esther. Thank you. There was a very clear explanation of the whole solid affairs. You touched upon a very important topic. In the Netherlands, I didn't know that there are media coming together, creating a Dutch data vault. Is that a good idea, or do we like the government to create a data vault for us, or other parties like medical parties? Maybe that's an interesting question to start with. Yes, please. Yeah. What do you think is the best?
I'm very pro open source, so I would think if I want to, should I be able to publish my own data part? And so if there is already thought about it, and
is it possible to create your own? Then you really have your digital autonomy, because that's what we're striving for. You're next, but please, Esther.
Unless someone from the public wants to pick up on this question first, because I have a lot of thoughts about it. I think this basically comes to the question. This is all about giving you a home. And what do you need to feel at home? And I think thinking about it as a house kind of helps. I think for some people, and you may be one of those people, it will only feel as your home if it is transparent in how it is built. Maybe you built it yourself, partially. For instance, you are the one who decides, I'm going to pick this piece of software, I'm going to run it on that cloud provider, so that it's more like a do-it-yourself. You can pick the subcomponents, couple them together and say like, yeah, this is the right constellation to have as my data pod. For some people, it will require that. The other question is, do you need to pay for it to feel as your home? Like, for instance, I am currently living with my boyfriend. It's not my house, I didn't pay for it. It doesn't feel that I don't feel at home there, because I trust him. And for instance, if I, as a Flemish citizen, trust the government, maybe for me that trust relationship is enough, and I don't necessarily need to be the one who picked together all of the components, and I'm not the one paying for it. So it's, are you the one combining it? Are you the one paying for it? And then the third one is, I think it's all about choice. Even if a company or a government says you, hey, if you don't want to worry about any of the practicalities or the finances, no worries, I've got you covered, here is your standard data pod. But if you want to choose your own, you're free to say, yeah, thank you, I'm not going to take the default option, I'm going to go and figure this out. So I think we need a system that gives a default option so that, for instance, my mom can also use it, but that people who want to have the control and want to have the choice are able to. Now, there is the technical part of putting together your own data pod, But then there's also, of course, if you're going to build this ecosystem, the various data suppliers who are going to put data there, often sensitive data, they're going to have some requirements around security, availability, etc., etc. I think there we are really going to see the tension between people who can technically do it and want to do it, but can they also reach the same security level and certifications needed to join this ecosystem? That's not something that's going to be so easy, I think.
Okay. Yeah. Interesting. Yeah. I come up with the mic.
This is a very nice system giving control to the users of their data. But the shadow side of it, what about data stress? Because you structure all these data and the users of the data, I don't want them to knock on my door all the time to reveal my policy, or they have their secret policies about my policy.
Good question. Yeah.
Yes. Here, I think it really depends. You really need to see it on a timeline. I think for those first use cases, they are going to be very explicit because we need to acquire a lot of new concepts, like what is a web ID, what is a pod. So I think for the first use cases, it's going to be deliberately very explicit around now you are picking your web ID, now you are creating your data pod, now you're loading your first data in your data pod, etc. If we then project that into the future 5 years, that would basically mean you being pinged 20 times a day with a service that asks for access to your data, etc. And that's a hassle that you just don't want. There, what some of my colleagues in the more societal parts of SolidLab are looking at is, are we going to need a data trust function? Some kind of third party who I'm going to trust my data management with. And I compare it a little bit to a bank. I don't necessarily myself invest my money into stocks, but at the bank I say, this is a part of my finance that I want to invest. This is my profile. I don't want any child labor. I don't want any mining of minerals, etc., etc. I don't want any guns involved in any of the things that you're doing with my money. This is my profile. This is the risk profile that I have. Now you can invest my money and I get a return from it. I think the same could happen with data, where we say, look, this is roughly my profile around data sharing. I trust you to manage and automate a lot of that data sharing. If I want to go in and check, I have full transparency. And I can always say, no, I want to do it differently if I want to do it. But I don't necessarily need to be the one who does it all. I can just give it to a third party that I trust.
The absolute certainty of your data. They don't want the proper data.
Yeah.
But I would like to have a false identity,
fake-
just like a fake identity.
A fake identity.
Because I don't think that I can blow up and start anew again.
Yeah.
So to have a fresh start again in the data system.
Yes.
Yeah.
A second, how do you say,
Second life.
digital alter ego. Is this a problem for Solid? Because it sounds like an interesting experiment.
Well,
to create several egos on the internet.
Indeed, and it really also comes close to this whole concept of deserving a second chance, the right to be forgotten. The way that I think about it is, so the first question I've heard a lot about this is, for instance, am I going to have a different professional profile than my more private profile, for instance? And how are we going to keep those two apart? Or even further, maybe I have my official profile on the one hand, but then at night I'm secretly also a drug dealer. And maybe I will definitely want a different identity for all of my drug dealing activities. And the only one who knows the link between this official Esther and then this the drug dealer Esther, it's only in my head.
Yeah, yeah.
As soon as the link between those identities becomes public, then it's basically all the same again.
Yeah.
So how to do this? The way that I see it evolving currently is you are going to have a official system where, for instance, Randstad wants to have access to your diploma data, and it's actually verified by the government. You can't do that without using your real proven identity there. But then for some other services, you're gonna want a temporary identity or a secret one. For instance, I mean, maybe not in the Netherlands or in Belgium this is really an issue, but I guess in a lot of countries, if you're not straight and you want to date, maybe you will want to use an identity that is separate from your official one. I see a lot of opportunity for split identities and temporary identities, but I think they will live a bit in a separate world, and then in the official world with the use cases where there's a real dollar amount to it, I think it will require strong identification, and it won't always be easy to do that in a less clearly identified way.
Yes, yeah. Okay, go ahead.
All right. I'd like to add a bit about this because there is some stuff going on in at least the European Union about this on the matter of decentralized identity, DID, as well as self-sovereign identity. And both of these things can be used to create an alias, which means that nobody really knows who you are, which you can sign with verified information about, say, I am 18 plus.
Yeah.
And that means that you can use an alias which is verifiably correct in at least that you are 18 plus without telling who you actually are. This can be done with a lot of other information, but the 18 plus stuff is just fairly obvious.
And on this AD plus stuff, that's also one of the use cases where the government is looking at, because they of course have your official data, your official record of birth, and there they are working on some kind of QR code app, where you, based on your data vault, can generate a QR code that shares minimal data about you. So for instance, if you want to buy alcohol, you just show a QR code that can then be scanned, and that basically turns green if you're 18 plus. But you don't communicate your name, where you live, or when exactly you were born. It's just a QR scan, and it turns green or it turns red. That's it. No more info is being exchanged.
Yeah, I come up to you in a second, but in the meantime, I have a own question. Esther, how do you prevent the following? Suppose we are living in a solid world. We still have Facebook, of course, and Google, things like that. I read an article that Facebook is even tracking you without being on Facebook.
Yeah.
How could this be? Can this be prevented when you're living in a solid world, or is it still the case? And you're looking at your Google Maps to find a restaurant, so Google knows where you are. How does this all get?
Yeah.
How does it all work in a solid world?
Solid is a technology, first and foremost. It's not a legal framework where you can force people to do certain things and to not do certain other things. For instance, a very much related question is, even if I share my data with you through Solid, and you take a screenshot of my data, I can't prevent you technically from doing that. But what we do now, we can say bad Facebook, bad Google, but we don't really have a valid technology and a business model behind it to offer an alternative. What we want to do with Solid is start pushing the boundaries on having not only the legal framework like the GDPR, also having the technology to back it up and the business model to back it up. And the more and more organizations and countries and people step into this new system, then it's going to be up to Facebook or whoever the party is that doesn't join that system to explain why they are not joining that system. And I think if that system works and if it grows, it's just going to be more interesting to join this new data sharing standard, because that is just going to be where everyone, the majority of the economy is going to be, because Now Facebook, the whole data sharing ecosystem as we currently have it, works very well if you're a big tech company who can invest in those first years in gathering a lot of data and then start making money. But a very large part of the economy doesn't benefit from that model. If we offer that chunk of the economy a data model that does work for them, I think eventually the data brokers of today will have to shift. And then it's all about, are we able to reach that tipping point where the data gravity lies here and no longer in the world of Facebook?
Data gravity, that's a nice word. Okay, thank you. Final question, because it's already 9 o'clock, I suppose. Go ahead.
Yes, I think you've already answered part of my question. But I wanted to ask you to still simply explain really the fundamental difference between the data owner and the data user. Because as you just mentioned, that a user of the data is someone who has access to your pod. But like you said, once they take in that information, either screenshot it or whatever, then they also in a way become somewhat of an owner, maybe not in the philosophical sense of a data owner, but my current understanding is that you indeed cannot really prevent it. So that is also not a problem that Solid is solving. Is that true?
Yeah. So indeed, Solid we cannot technically prevent someone from taking a copy of your data. What you can do through Solid is you will have an entire log of who are the parties that I've given access to this particular piece of data, for which purpose and how long. If you can then prove that they have gotten access to your data in a way that you didn't allow, you actually have a log to now go to the judge and say, here is my entire record. Look, they're clearly not there, or I clearly revoked access here. They were still using it. I am now suing them. So it can assist the legal framework. Then when it comes to data owner, if I may take it in a very philosophical way, I think one of the best work that we've done over the past year with our legal team at SolidLab is really exploring legally what does data ownership mean. Because typically data is a shared good. Vivi Latenoia, let's say the chair of my data, she has this really nice story where she says, my date of birth, yep, it's a personal bit of information about me. It's also a very important day in the life of my mother and my father. So it also says something about when my mom gave birth, which is a medical fact about my mom rather than an administrative fact about me. So a lot of data is shared. If, for instance, a energy company would put the data about my energy efficiency of my home in my pod, they will have to put a lot of care into curating the data, putting it in the right linked data format for it to be interoperable in this ecosystem that we are building. So of course they have put a lot of effort into it. They also have a stake in my data. Or the government may say, yeah, of course we want you to be able to share your data so that you can have a better life, but we also have a duty towards you as a citizen to protect you. So we are going to govern this ecosystem and we're going to make sure that there are no malignant apps that are going to enter that ecosystem and go hunting for your data to then sell it off. So I think either by law or by governance, we're going to try and do a lot to make it as safe as possible. But of course, we can't technically nail it down.
Okay. Thank you, Esther, for your very nice presentation and the answers. Esther, thank you very much for talking about this fascinating topic about a solid world, which gives us back our digital autonomy, because that's what it's all about. I think that's a very important thing to work on. I wish you very good luck. The 4th of May, what does it mean for you personally? How exciting is this day for you?
Very much. I mean, this is something that we've been working on for now 2 years.
I can imagine.
Yeah, and I hope it's not only the start of the story in Flanders, but that the Netherlands will join very, very, very soon.
Yeah. Let's hope so. A big hand for Esther. Thank you very much.